We're excited to talk about Let the Lord Sort Them with Maurice Chammah. If you're watching online and have questions, please post them in the chat. And for those of you in the room, be thinking about what you'd like to ask, and we'll get to everyone's questions at the end of the program. So I'm going to start with introductions. Maurice is a journalist and staff writer for the Marshall Project. His reporting on the criminal justice system has been published by The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Esquire, and Mother Jones. And he received the 2019 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Book Award. So welcome. We're so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Do you want to start with doing a brief reading from the book?
Yeah,
And kind of an overview?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll grab my copy here. The book is called Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. And it came out in 2021, but I had by then been working on it for 4 to 5 years. And even 4 to 5 years before that, I had started doing journalism about death penalty cases and would frequently be assigned to do a case. I was an intern actually at a news outlet back then, the Texas Tribune. And I'd get assigned and I would interview, the prosecutor in the case, the defense lawyer, maybe a family member. And I found that there were these sort of incredibly rich stories that I wasn't necessarily getting to tell. I would hear about the way that a murder had impacted an entire family over multiple generations, and the way that, somebody who had served on a jury in a death penalty case was sort of never the same afterwards. And of course, when I was writing these 800, 1,000 word, short little articles, there was just no way to get into these things. So over time, I kind of worked towards a book where the idea was that I could kind of give a kaleidoscopic view of the way that the death penalty touches and sort of affects all these different people who are affected by it in one way or another. And in addition, I saw that there was this sort of historical sort of story that was very, very clean and sort of simple in a way that starting in the 1970s, the death penalty returned in Texas. There was about a 10-year period, a lot of the 1960s, some of the 70s, where the death penalty virtually disappeared in the sense that executions were halted. There was a moratorium. We can talk more about that. But then over the course of the 80s, 90s, reaching up to the year 2000, the numbers just climbed. More and more people sentenced to death, more and more people being executed. And then right around the year 2000, there was a peak, and then it's been falling ever since. And so in thinking about the book, I wanted to zoom out from all these individual people's stories. And I still wanted to, of course, talk about these stories, but also put them in a framework people could understand of this rise and fall and lay out the sort of big picture reasons why there was a rise and why there was a fall. Why did we embrace the death penalty only to then reject it? And what does that sort of say about us? So with that, I'll read. I actually think it's best to read the very beginning of the book because you don't need to know anything, or if you do, then I haven't done a very good job. And this is, well, I'll just begin. I'll hold to my own rule and not say anything. One afternoon in November 1982, Warden Jack Persley called a meeting of his senior staff. Persley ran the oldest prison in Texas, which is located a few blocks from the courthouse square in Huntsville, a small city in the eastern part of the state. The Huntsville unit is nicknamed the Walls because of the tall red brick fortifications that surround its grounds. The bricks were made by prisoners. Across the street stood the offices of the Texas Department of Corrections, the agency overseeing the state's prisons. So on one side of the street, Persley gave orders, but on the other side, he took them. The staff had been all told of this meeting by phone rather than the usual written memo, and when the unit chaplain, Carol Pickett, arrived, he immediately noticed a pinched mood. The typical coffee and donuts were absent. Pickett asked the head of the maintenance crew what this was about, and he didn't know either. And so together they asked a major who didn't know. And after about 15 minutes or so, Persley appeared, wearing his usual suit, boots, and Stetson hat. His face was grim. As he passed by Pickett, he murmured, "You're not going to like this." Persley removed his hat and set it down. "We will soon be having an execution," he said, December 7th, shortly after midnight. Many years later, Pickett could remember the stunned silence in the room, the knots in his own stomach. The last time an execution had taken place here was 18 years ago, and nobody in the room had been around back then. In the intervening years, legal challenges had halted all executions, forcing the state legislature to write new capital punishment laws in 1973. State legislators feared electrocutions would be too much of a spectacle, a circus sideshow, one called it. So in 1977, they adopted a new execution method called lethal injection. Though the procedure had been developed in Oklahoma, Persley's team would be the first in the country to put it into practice. I don't know a thing about what we've got to do, Persley told the group. All of us have a great deal of learning to do in a short period of time. He read tasks off a clipboard. 2 men would greet the condemned man at the death house. A tie-down team would strap him to the gurney. Others would load the body into a hearse and accompany the vehicle to the prison gate. The warden led the men through heavy iron doors and into the old death house. They walked through a hallway, past several small cells where men had once spent their final days. The atmosphere reminded Pickett, the chaplain, of a medieval dungeon. The walls were painted gray and there was little ventilation, making it feel as if, quote, all of the air had somehow been sucked out of the room. The chaplain was not given a task at first, even as he was invited in the days after the meeting to watch the preparations. The warden was a former high school football star, fastidious about the smallest details of prison management, and he decided to run drills, requiring the many partial executioners to complete their assigned tasks over and over again until they grew rote. They practiced bringing the prisoner to a cell near the death chamber, a room of less than 200 square feet, and then walking him to the gurney. One young lieutenant agreed to play this role during the rehearsals, allowing each of his limbs to be strapped down. He played his part calmly until one day he snapped. With no warning, the lieutenant went into a full panic, fighting off the tie-down team and refusing to go to his own mock death. The team paused briefly in surprise, then muscle memory kicked in and they managed to force him down. The warden admitted that this had been planned. He had instructed the lieutenant to fight because, quote, a scene like that is always a possibility. Then he turned to the chaplain. Your job will be to seduce his emotions. Pickett chuckled uncomfortably. The plan was for him to be on hand early in the morning to meet the van from death row. If he arrived ready to fight, hopefully a day getting his spiritual affairs in order would calm him down, making the execution easier on everyone involved. Pickett would later tell the story in many different permutations, slightly altering the dialogue and the sequence of events, but that one word, seduce, was in every telling, a hard pebble in his memory that never dissolved.
All right. So you kind of started this conversation with your overview. But let's talk about some basic history and facts around the death penalty. And what do you think are the most important things someone should know as we're starting kind of a journey to learn about it?
Well, I think the kind of big fact that I've found has always surprised people when I talk about the death penalty, it certainly surprised me, is that we haven't actually always had it in America. It seems like this thing that we've just been debating forever, but that executions have always been with us. You know, we all have a dim understanding that there was the electric chair, there was hangings, all these different sort of forms. But we actually virtually got rid of the death penalty in the 1960s. The polls showed that it was incredibly unpopular. I found this quote in, I think it was an old issue of the Texas Observer magazine, where the district attorney of Harris County, Texas, which includes Houston, and Houston would go on to become an epicenter of the death penalty. But back in the 1960s, the district attorney of Harris County said, basically, I don't think there's any point to the death penalty. I don't think we need to use it. And just had this very dismissive attitude. And even as the death penalty returned to Texas, to Alabama, Louisiana, many southern states, and then also western states like California and Nevada, it still remained gone essentially in much of the Northeast. My wife's family is in Michigan, and so I know that the death penalty disappeared there in the 1850s and has never come back. So even to say we have the death penalty as Americans is only partially true, because it really varies based on where you live. And then even more, and of course I could I get to a point where it's almost nerdy, so I sort of have to stop myself but when you get like into the data on it, even within Texas, if you commit the same murder in, let's say, Tarrant County versus Collin County versus Travis County, where I'm from, you may or may not actually face the death penalty, because the prosecutors are making decisions about whether to seek death in any individual case. And so it's actually this really complicated sort of patchy map that we have the death penalty at all.
So one of the things I remember from your book is you talked about rural counties, kind of building on that. Rural counties typically do not seek the death penalty because the costs of doing a death penalty case and everything that comes after a death penalty case are so prohibitive that they choose not to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I said before that the death penalty had been disappearing since about the year 2000. And one reason for that is that in primarily rural counties, it's simply too expensive. Then when you consider at the same time in big cities, I'll say not Fort Worth, but in other big cities in Texas, often the district attorneys are increasingly liberal and progressive and just oppose the death penalty ideologically. And so it disappears in Austin and Houston and Dallas. But in the small towns, you basically had these district attorneys admitting, they would often admit to me when I'd interview them, look, I support the death penalty. I think it's great, but we can't afford it. It costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring in the experts on both sides to be witnesses at these trials. It costs, we basically have to shut our courthouse down for weeks on end to do the trial. And then we have to fight out appeals over years and years. And it's simply not worth it, especially if, let's say, the victim's family isn't going out there and telling, the media, we want the death penalty. One interesting tidbit, or at least I found this fascinating, was that a lot of small counties actually got together and sort of pooled their money, paying into what was almost like an insurance plan. So in your county, there may only be a murder that qualifies for the death penalty like every 5 years, but you pay into this pool every year. And then when it's your turn and your county has a death sentence, you get the money from this pool. And there was a magazine published for local county administrators. And I imagine this is like typically a fairly I don't want to say uninteresting to read for most people who are not county administrators, but it's like very much like a internal magazine for this world of people. And I got a copy of this magazine, and in big letters on the front, it said murder insurance. And I was like, wow, that's a great magazine cover. I think it was County Magazine. Yeah.
That's interesting. And also, the buying, paying into a pool to afford insurance to be able to afford to do these type of cases is a little interesting, but also kind of scary.
Yeah, well, and I always want to also say that, there's the argument to be made from the other side, which is to say, well, maybe it's so expensive because the defense is driving up the costs, and hiring experts that they don't really need. But the problem is that every time the courts and the legislature and Congress have tried to cut the cost in this process, it has measurably increased the risk of an innocent person being executed, or someone who has a severe, mental illness, or, the problems that then arise from, it's sort of like you get what you pay for. And if the examples show that when we skimp on it, the results can be pretty stomach turning for most of us.
So the Supreme Court kind of overturned the death penalty in the 70s and basically said, we don't like how this is written. They didn't say it was unconstitutional. They said, we don't like how this is written, rewrite it. And that's kind of what brought it back. Can you kind of talk about what the arguments of that case were? And then, particularly, because this is a lot of where everything starts for you in this book, how Texas addressed that and how that has kind of played out over time.
Yeah, and I will say this was one of the most challenging parts of this book to research and write, because I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school, and understanding the Supreme Court decisions. I mean, sometimes they can be easy to read because they're narratives involving facts of a case, but sometimes the legal arguments can get fairly dense, and so I had to interview a lot of lawyers and law professors to make sense of it. So in 1972, the Supreme Court said, basically, the death penalty as it currently exists is entirely unconstitutional. It's not that it's never constitutional to execute someone. It's that the laws that we have, the sort of structure for how someone ends up on death row is creating basically these arbitrary outcomes. There's a famous quote where one Supreme Court justice said, getting the death penalty is like being struck by lightning. 100 people commit the exact same murder, and who gets sentenced to death and executed is just sort of random, right? So that is what the problem was. And so then that puts state legislators in this really sort of difficult position of, well, we have to write these laws. And when I started working on the book, I was also, my first priority was to interview these legislators, because I knew these were men who were working the height of their careers in 1973. This was 2017. So I knew that some of them might not be around anymore, or it was sort of on the edge, right? So I tracked a lot of them down and interviewed as many as I could. And they basically admitted, 50, or I guess, what is that? I'm going to have to do quick math, 50-ish years after the fact. We don't know, we didn't know what we were doing, right? The Supreme Court had written this, thousands and thousands of words, hundreds of pages of gobbledygook basically to us. And we had to take it and make sense of it in this new law. Now, some states were saying, how about we just give the death penalty to everybody who commits first-degree murder? 100% of people, right? That was, I think, Louisiana and North Carolina. Over here, you had Florida, you had a few other states that said, well, let's create this super complicated process. And you can debate whether this process works, but the idea was like, okay, the murder has taken place and there are going to be aggravating factors, which are, things that make it worse. This person has committed many other crimes. This person tortured the victim before their death, what have you. And then mitigating factors, which is a legal way of saying, they had a very terrible childhood, or this is their first crime, or they showed a lot of remorse, things that make it maybe less likely that they should get the death penalty. And you weigh these back and forth. Texas was unique in coming in with this very strange law in between these two poles. And the Texas law could be boiled basically down to a single question. I mean, there was sort of more around it, but ultimately the question was, do we think this person is going to kill again if we don't execute them? It was, the language is something like, do they represent a continuing threat to society? And it created this very strange situation where the members of the jury, who could be any of us, right? You get called to jury duty, you think you're going to go figure out whether somebody's guilty or innocent. But then you have to answer the question, is this person going to be dangerous in the future? Which is essentially asking you to predict the future, right? And to that end, you would have prosecutors, bring in these psychologists who would say, well, I interviewed this killer, and based on my psychology, know how 100%, he's definitely going to kill again. But that was, of course, proven to be just sort of junk science and not rooted in any kind of basis. But even still, jurors had to do it. So that's changed a little bit. That question is still on the books; it's still asked. But I think that question and the sort of strangeness, and I think one big takeaway for me was that you can kind of apply some of these lessons to any bill that goes on at the state legislature. Like, I think we have this idea that a lot of thought and effort goes into bills that are passed at the legislature, and sometimes that's true. But then this was like one of the most important bills ever, and these legislators basically said to me like, we threw it together over a weekend. We didn't know what we were doing. And I probably would have done it differently had I known how it would play out, but what are you going to do? I'm retired. See ya. I mean, that was basically the gist of it. And that was very sobering, because I was like, there's any number of public policy choices where if you could get if you wait 40, 50 years and get the legislators, the Congress people on the record, like that's basically what you're going to get. And that's a dark, scary place to be.
Okay, let's take some directions
Yeah,
there.
sorry.
Yeah.
It's funny that it's funny to me that the most depressing thing I've said so far wasn't even about executions, right? It was about just like how laws get made, but what are you going to do? You have to find the humor where you can.
Yes. You mentioned important figures and advocates on both sides of the debate throughout the book. I found the story about how the Texas Resource Center started, and the fact that that's the name they chose purposely. It started, evolved, and then eventually became several different organizations. Really interesting. Can you talk about the work involved for those advocates that help represent death row inmates and the challenges they face?
Yeah. So I think just to zoom it out for historical context, before the 1970s, when the death penalty existed in the US, there were always activists who would befriend the person on death row, who would go to the governor and say, this person shouldn't be executed. Please, spare them because of X, Y, and Z. But in the 1970s, the Supreme Court, threw out those laws, and then they approved the new laws. And basically, that was the Supreme Court almost like stepping in and taking ownership of the death penalty, so to a certain extent. But it became this there are these law professors who say that the death penalty got constitutionalized, which means all the questions about whether someone should be executed or not became legal questions, as opposed to the kinds of political or human, questions that would involve more governors and presidents, right? Which meant that if you wanted to fight the death penalty or to pursue it, to make sure that it happened, you really had to become a lawyer. You had to go to law school. And I became fascinated. There are pockets of this book where I basically did more research than I could ever use. Like you get obsessed with the thing, and then in the end, it's like 2 pages of the book, and you're like, well, I have all this knowledge. And for me, the pocket that I knew, even as I was doing it, probably wouldn't get the space that it could, because it could get its own whole book, is the world of these young, idealistic lawyers who committed themselves in the 1980s and 90s to fighting against the death penalty. They were they tended to be young and idealistic. A lot of them moved from, going to law school at Harvard or Columbia to Texas or Mississippi or Alabama to fight the death penalty. And they really kind of saw themselves as like the freedom riders of the 1960s. Certainly the most famous figure in that generation would be Bryan Stevenson, who's maybe a familiar name to some of you. He wrote the book Just Mercy, which became a film several years ago. He went and worked for one of these little, basically legal firms in Alabama. And the one in Texas was based in Austin, and they called it the Texas Resource Center, which is, of course, it's a name that tells you nothing about what they do, Texas Resource Center. And I asked them, like, why so vague? And they said that they wanted to shroud what they do because it was so unpopular. Basically, being the lawyer for a guy on death row is, at least in the 80s and 90s. Now, I think in certain circles, it would be seen as a kind of noble career path. But in the 1980s and 90s, it was, these people got death threats. They got bomb threats at their buildings. Even at a less extreme level, they told me, you go to a bar or a restaurant and you meet someone for the first time and they ask you what you do. And you have to make that quick calculation. Like, do I tell them that I represent people on death row? Because it could just basically, you could see like basically their face shut down and then just think that you are like a handmaid into evil or something, right? This was the 80s and 90s. And so it was also kind of the era where, the 70s had seen a lot of really famous serial killers. And I think that there was a perception of people who committed murder that they were all just Hannibal Lecter, right? And so these people, these young lawyers knew that their clients on death row had often mental illnesses, intellectual disabilities, had suffered incredibly severe abuse as children, but they also knew that the public perception of their clients was Hannibal Lecter, right? And so they had this really hard job, and they were all doing it in their 20s. And I was just fascinated by what that must have been like and why you would continue to do that. And a lot of them burned out and gave up that work. A lot of them moved into other areas of the law. One became a baker, I think. I mean, some of them really, you could see the burnout was obvious because, especially in the 1990s, there were, dozens of execution dates every year. And so you were just constantly racing against the clock. It was like dead man walking every day, right? That like 11th hour fight to stop an execution. And it was really, really brutal, but sort of out of that cauldron emerged this generation of like very fascinating, passionate, committed defense lawyers who I profile in the book. I profile one in particular who kind of emerged from that world and really learned, basically, going back to what I said about, Hannibal Lecter, she learned how to humanize her clients in the public eye and learned how to convince prosecutors and jurors that her clients had committed terrible, heinous murders, but were more than just that and deserved some measure of mercy. So.
And before I move on to my next question, so there's a point in the book where you talk about like the Supreme Court and many other people become where like they hate those lawyers that work for the Texas Resource Center, right? Because they feel like they're playing games and doing all these last minute tricks and those sort of things. Can you kind of talk about that?
Oh yeah. In fact, there was this really dramatic scene where one of these lawyers was arguing at the Supreme Court, and Justice Scalia basically chewed her out in front of everybody and said, like, you know, you guys are basically throwing sand into the gears of justice, and you're purposefully playing games with the law to try to halt these executions. And but defense lawyers were like, well, I mean, you've hired us to represent these men for their lives, and you think that people should go, you're trying to execute people, but you also think they deserve lawyers. Don't you expect us to do everything we possibly can to save their lives? I mean, what do you expect, right? But the Supreme Court, the federal judiciary, and not to mention prosecutors, were incredibly frustrated with these lawyers. They would go to the Texas State Bar and accuse them of lying. They would try to charge them with they would charge them with basically like witness tampering, and they have these various tools to try to marginalize them further. And one more dynamic I always thought was sort of complicated and interesting was that they were often these like 26, 28-year-olds, and they were going to these small towns they'd never been before. They're from they went to Harvard, they moved to Austin, and then they're coming up to Collin County or Tarrant County or wherever. And they're basically like walking into the courthouse and they're saying, this death sentence was racist, and you, Mr. Local Defense Lawyer, did a terrible job, and because of that, your client's going to get executed. And there were plenty of times where I thought, it's easy to have the hindsight of 50 years earlier, to have the hindsight of 50 years later saying, well, they were sort of on the right side of history in certain ways. But I can't imagine being that longtime defense lawyer or judge in a town and having this 28-year-old from Harvard come in and tell me I'm racist. Like you can see how maybe they didn't always have the best bedside manner, I guess is fair to say.
Right. Like they're fighting for someone's life. They're not really concerned about if they're hurting your feelings.
Yeah, exactly. Like the line, there was one defense lawyer who said to me once that the line between righteousness and self-righteousness is very thin. And I definitely learned that from this world.
Oh, I love that. That's a great quote. All right, so let's talk about on the other side.
Sure.
Elsa Alcala weaves in and out of the book, and I find where she starts in the book and where she ends in the book to be super interesting. Can you talk about who she is and what impact she's had on death penalty cases in Texas?
Yes, Elsa Alcala is among the most fascinating people I've met, and basically, I'll just lay it out that she was born in Kingsville, Texas, in the 1960s. She was one of 5 siblings. She was, I think the third of 5. And when she was in middle school, both of her parents died. One in the aftermath of a surgery, and one in a car accident. And she and her siblings were basically left without their parents. The oldest was in high school, the youngest was in elementary school. And this was an era where, if that happened today, you just imagine someone's going to call CPS and these kids are going to become foster children. But for some reason in Kingsville, and all the kids corroborated this story, they were basically left alone to raise themselves. And their grandmother, their aunt would check on them, but the oldest one was just old enough that she could sort of put on a brave front. And so these kids just lived together, and cooked for each other and helped each other with homework. And all 5 of them ended up with stable, impressive professional careers. One of them's a college professor now. One of them owns a business. Elsa is, as I said, one of these siblings. She realizes that she's passionate about debate, does that in high school, does it in college. The path for kids who are really into debate is to go to law school. So she gets admitted to University of Texas in Austin. And then after that, I think that during a career fair, is enticed to come work for the Harris County District Attorney's Office, which is the lead prosecution, law enforcement branch in Houston. And this is in the 1990s at the height of the death penalty. And so Elsa rises in the ranks. Everyone I interviewed about her back then said that she was basically like a brilliant, intense, worked crazy hours and was just like very forceful in her arguments in court. And she sent multiple men to death row. She also grew incredibly close. And I tell this was one story that I was like really moved to find and felt like I really wanted to highlight in the book is there was a family of one of the victims in these cases, and she was pursuing the death sentence for the man who committed this murder, but she also grew incredibly close to the family. She almost, the sister of the victims in this case came to see Elsa as like an older sister figure, and they kept up for decades after this. They're still in touch today. So Elsa sends men to death row. She believes in the death penalty. It's a culture of the death penalty in the Harris County DA's office. So she told me stories about how after she got her first death sentence, the district attorney there, whose name was Johnny Holmes, invited her into his office and gave her a commemorative pen shaped like a plastic syringe. And that was like her, and he said to her, she's quoting him, he says, "Congratulations, killer." And I actually interviewed him at one point and said, like, did this really happen? And he's like, yeah. Like, he didn't deny it. He just sort of.
He's like, yeah, I wish I could say no to that now.
Right. And there were a handful of things where he's like, that was probably in bad taste, basically. But he still believed in the death penalty and was unapologetic. He's his own character in the book. I'm kind of riffing on a few topics here, but I wanted to say that when you work on a book like this that has like, dozens and dozens of interviews and all these cases, you kind of have to make these big choices about like, who am I going to feature? Who am I going to really focus on? And initially I thought I was going to focus on the DA in that story, Johnny Holmes, the one who gave the pen, because I just thought like, here's a larger than life character. It's like he stepped out of a John Wayne movie. He's got the handlebar mustache, his email address was like crime fighter and then a string of numbers at something.com. So like he was like a character, and as a writer, you're sort of like compelled by these people who just seem larger than life. But then as I worked on it, it started to feel like, well, another thing that you want in like certainly in a fictional character, and then also in someone that you highlight in nonfiction, is that like they go through some kind of change or some sort of transformation that's illustrative or educational in some way. And this man did not go through that at all. He is the same today as he was back then. When I did the interview with him, he drove away in a truck and had a big bumper sticker on the back that said "deplorable," which marked him as like a very strong supporter of the former president. And he was unapologetic about the death penalty. And so it just felt like there's only so much you can kind of say about this man and his career. Elsa, to go back to your actual question, Elsa works in that office and then is elevated and becomes a judge. She becomes a judge in a criminal court in Houston and then an appeals court. And then eventually she's elevated to the top criminal appeals court in Texas. It's called the Court of Criminal Appeals, and it's in Austin. And I often think about her, especially now with the Supreme Court, the stuff that's gone on the past few years. There was this one point, this is a tidbit from a few years ago, but remember when Donald Trump was going to nominate someone to the Supreme Court, and there was sort of a short list, and you'd hear about these other judges. They didn't end up making it. They didn't get picked, but they were like on the short list. And one of them was a woman whose career looked a lot like Elsa Alcala's, except that she was in Florida. And there's this sense in which when I look at Elsa Alcala's career, that she could have become that Supreme Court shortlisted person. But the way that she would have done that is by remaining extremely conservative and pro-death penalty. And she didn't. She, on this Court of Criminal Appeals in Austin, starts to see dozens and dozens of cases over the months, and the injustices of individual cases start to compound for her. And she's just sort of horrified. And she comes to question the death penalty, if not the fact of it, if not, sort of like the Supreme Court in the 70s, she reaches a point where it's not that she thinks the death penalty is unjust always, but that the way we're carrying it out, the laws around it are just totally broken. over time, she becomes more and more extreme in her views, and then just says, like, we can't have the death penalty anymore because this system is unjust, it's racist, it's arbitrary, it's biased in all kinds of ways towards whether people have money or not, and people with intellectual disabilities are being executed. And reading, I can interview her, and I did interview her quite a bit, but you also have all these court opinions where you can kind of track her intellectual transformation. And I made just like a binder of these opinions and just like read them over weeks. And it was almost like reading a novel of how somebody had transformed the way they see the criminal justice system. And that was why I wanted to focus on her so much in the book, because she felt like she illustrated a change in thinking about the criminal justice system that many people in the US have gone through in the last 20, 30 years.
It was interesting because you talked about like her dissents, right? So she gets
That's
to
true.
that.
She didn't win these cases.
Right. They're all dissent opinions, but how through her dissent opinions, she's actually trying to like educate her fellow judges about here's why these things are issues and those sorts of things. I just found that really interesting, that here's someone who, at the same time is still in touch with a family member of someone she put on death row, right? But then she's writing these dissent opinions, and obviously she's not on that court anymore because she lost her election at some point.
Well, no, she actually retired.
Oh, she did. Okay.
But the writing was sort of on the wall long term for her. But like I said, there's this alternate reality where she became the Supreme Court justice, right? Or at least elevated up into the kind of like conservative federal judiciary. And she often, I think she particularly didn't like immigration policy under Trump, because she felt like her own rise, which was basically in the Republican Party, it was Governor Bush and then Governor Perry who appointed her to these courts. She said to me, I think my career was like a encapsulation of this era where the Republican Party really wanted to appeal to young Latino voters and elevate people like me to be these sort of inspiring role models for young Latinos. One other thought about her I want to share too is that I've thought a lot about how did that early experience, losing her parents and growing up. In some ways, her family seems like it was very lucky that none of her siblings ended up in prison, or in the throes of substance abuse, just given that set of facts about her childhood. And I think in the 1990s, her thinking was, well, this was my childhood, so what's this murderer's excuse? Like I also had it bad. So it made her unsympathetic to these people. But then the flip is that when she's on the court and she's hearing these stories of the utter abject, poverty and abuse that people grew up with, I think her upbringing as she got older made her much more empathetic to them. And she saw, but for this break and this break and this break, I could have ended up on a very different path. And so, not who am I to judge these other people? I mean, she's clearly a judge, but she sort of brought a new empathy to these situations.
Just checking time. Okay. All right. So the last part of the book talks about some more recent histories with the death penalty. We've talked about this a little bit with kind of the decline and some of the reasons why it's declining, but one of the more recent things is pharmaceutical companies making it more difficult to obtain the drugs necessary, and states looking for alternate sources for them. I'm interested in hearing what you think the current landscape is in regards to the death penalty as a whole, and kind of what you think in the next few years might be some things.
Yeah, it's the death penalty is very chaotic, I would say right now. And this actually makes life a little bit hard for journalists because, I work at the Marshall Project, and my colleagues and I sometimes cover the death penalty, and we're often trying to cover not just the news of the day, but like, here's what it means. And here's like, let's zoom out a little bit and try to explain like, what's the bigger trend here? But often it feels like the sort of incoming information is just very noisy and very complex. So about 10 years ago, pharmaceutical companies stopped allowing their drugs to be used for execution. They shut down the mechanisms, of distribution that would get the drugs to prisons to carry them out. And so the prisons turned to kind of small compounding pharmacies. These were often kind of independent mom and pop pharmacies to mix the drugs to order. Often state legislatures would pass laws to make the source of the drugs secret, so that if you're the pharmacy that makes the drugs, that you can sell it to the prison without it being a PR problem for you. But then some states even then couldn't get the drugs, and are increasingly talking about, although it hasn't really come to fruition yet, but are talking about alternate methods of execution, the firing squad, gas chambers. I mean, all just stuff that makes us all go, ooh, you know. And I wonder, and also some states do still on occasion use the electric chair. I think Tennessee most recently. So you're seeing these stories of maybe it looks like we're going to almost like step backwards in time to these execution methods that we thought we had abandoned in the past. But then on the other hand, history keeps sort of driving forward in terms of the trends I talked about. So like there really still are fewer executions every year, and or any given year might kind of fluctuate a little, but the long-term trend is still executions down, death sentences, which is like, you know, the beginning of the process, the trials where people are sent to death row, those numbers are plummeting. There used to be hundreds of people sent to death row every year, and now there's dozens, and sometimes I think in Texas a couple of years ago there were like 4 people sent to death row in the whole state. So the numbers are just so low that eventually, in a sense, there won't be anyone left to execute. They'll either have been executed or they will have died of natural causes in prison, you know, experiencing what is a kind of de facto life sentence. There are already many states where there is a death row, there are people on it, but they don't carry out executions. They have no interest in carrying them out. California dismantled its death chamber, so there isn't even a way to do it, and yet they still have death row. So I think you're going to have kind of this slow slide to where we have the death penalty in name, but not in practice. Or if we use it, it's going to be more and more rare. But then you sort of have to kind of balance that in your mind against this other possibility that we're going to keep carrying out executions, but in more and more kind of experimental and possibly gruesome ways. So that's like it's a complicated picture, but that's what it is.
Well, I think it's interesting too. This feels like a more recent phenomenon where you have like all these celebrities that start kind of intervening in and bringing stories to light. Some maybe have the facts, some maybe don't have the facts, sort of thing. Does it feel like we think that sort of has become the trend now and it's going to continue? It's
a big trend. I wonder. So you all may have seen that like Kim Kardashian will often talk about individual cases. I had thought that was a new phenomenon, but it's actually not. So it was one of the more fun parts of the book research was actually seeing how many celebrities had been involved with death penalty stuff, like back in the 90s. So in 1993 or 4, Danny Glover spoke to the Texas legislature about a case. You did have the Pope came and visited a man on death row. So there were these stories, and there's always been a kind of celebrity interest. The question, I think, about celebrities is whether they're going to ever push past the kind of cases that are really about, like, is this person innocent or guilty? And into the cases where we know they're guilty, but there's some argument to be made for not executing them, right? Because you got your people where there's like a real question, did this person even do it? Are we executing someone innocent? And you often see celebrities get into those cases. But then you push further into it, and I know that in most cases, it would be a stretch to say most people on death row are innocent. That's not true. Mostly they've done it. Mostly they admit to it. But often there are claims that would, I think, unsettle many members of the public. A severe mental illness, you know, the abject poverty and trauma of the childhood that I described earlier. And I'm kind of curious, like, are celebrities going to kind of tiptoe in that direction and kind of step out on that limb a little more, and sort of go to bat for, let's say, there was a famous case under Trump where it was a federal prisoner, a woman who was being executed, and the abuse in her childhood was so stomach turning. The crime itself was also stomach turning, and I won't repeat the details here, but all of it was just so hard to read and hear about. And you did start to see, I don't know if I would say, you know, Kim Kardashian didn't don't think she got involved in that case, but you started to see more influential people, especially people who work in the world of like gendered violence and who really care about like the sexual abuse of children and of women, kind of step out on her behalf. And I think we may see some of that sort of organizing in the next few years.
All right, so I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll open it up for audience questions. You've mentioned it off and on, but let's talk about your research process and how you gather information for so many sources and then work them together to tell the story you want.
Sure. I mean, this is obviously one of the more fun things for me to talk about because it's the actual, like the research process. It's like an interesting challenge to figure out how you deal with a big volume of material and translate that into something readable. It's whether it's readable is up for you guys to writable, I'll say, because I can't tell you whether it's readable or not. But so the way I thought about the research was that there were these different eras and different places and different kind of institutions, like the Texas Resource Center I mentioned, or the Harris County DA's office, that I was fascinated by and wanted to be able to just kind of paint a picture for a reader, even if, you know, I only had a few pages to do it. And in order to paint that picture, I needed to talk to a fair number of people about what it was like to work in a place like that. So I would just basically look for anyone I can who had worked there, whether it's on their LinkedIn profile, whether they were connected to me by someone else, whether I see their name in some archival document. I would just make these lists of people. I would go looking for them. I would try to interview as many of them as I can. And then throughout that process, certain individuals like Elsa Alcala would kind of like rise up in terms of, I just find myself thinking about them, you know, when I'm cooking dinner, like they're the people that would just sort of stay with you. And one lesson I've learned from other nonfiction writers that I admire a lot is that the people who just kind of stick with you and you can't necessarily explain why are also the most likely to stick with readers. So, you know, trust your gut on who is compelling to you. And that takes practice. But so these people would kind of emerge from the interviews as kind of a vehicle or you kind of use them as an individual to kind of represent a larger group of people that they were a member of. They're kind of the symbolic standard bearer for their sort of group of people that you interviewed. And then even within those people's careers, you know, I knew that I wanted to focus on Elsa Alcala and also this defense lawyer, Dana Lynn Reeser. Each of them had worked on, many, many cases over the years. So then it was a matter of interviewing them, learning about which cases they worked on, going and getting the records for those cases, reading, you know, the trial transcripts and what have you in the archives, and then making decisions about, well, what big picture issue can I kind of tie this individual case to? So, for example, I mentioned that Elsa grew to be very close friends with this victim family member. And I thought, oh, this is perfect because in the 90s, there was also the victims' rights movement. And I need to address that in the book. And I need to address just this general phenomenon where victims and their support for the death penalty was one of the driving forces behind seeking it so often. And then I thought, well, this is so perfect that she was friends with this victim family member almost as like a storytelling tool because it represents this kind of larger reality. So I can pick this one narrow thing. I can kind of get a little bit granular. I can tell you what kind of trees were outside the house when the murder took place. But I know that the reader can kind of stay with me and understand that for every story I'm telling, there's 100 I'm not telling. And I've decided that this one kind of illustrates a bigger picture.
I love that. All right, we're going to open it for questions. So what we'll do is, for those of you who have a question in the room, I'll have you ask your question and I'm going to repeat it so that the people who are online can hear us. And then Lynn will read the ones from anybody online. So do we have any questions in the room?
We have one online.
Okay, why don't we start with that then?
We have somebody who remembers Dana Lynn Reeser as a campus presence in the 80s and 90s, and just asked if you could talk a little bit more about her.
Yeah. So I told you about Elsa Alcala. So the other kind of major, I honestly think that there's sort of two tentpoles in the book in terms of who you meet and get to know and hopefully come to care about. One of them is Elsa Alcala, and the other one is Dana Lynn Reeser. She is the lawyer who I described as working in that kind of cauldron of defense lawyers in the early 90s. Before that, she had been a kind of rabble-rousing activist at the University of Texas campus in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And I thought her youth, and so it's of course much less kind of like emotionally complicated. You know, she had a kind of stable middle-class upbringing, unlike Elsa Alcala. But she confronted this question as a young, idealistic, liberal person, which is like, how do I make change in the world? And the way that she went about that just felt very interesting and inspiring to me in various ways. So she goes to UT, she gets really interested in history, and she gets interested in the sort of historical injustices that her own people are responsible for. So she starts taking African-American history classes that focus on lynchings. And sometimes kids would say to her, why are you studying our history, right? Why are you studying lynchings? This is African-American history. You're the only white person in this class. And over the course of several years, she came to realize, well, no, in some ways, the story of lynching is also the story of she used the phrase, what the heck is wrong with white people, right? Like, because it was my people that were actually like doing the lynching. And so that's history. That's not like, we don't need to see that as like just African-American history. That's American history, right? So I saw in her story a lot about how, as a young idealistic white liberal, you sort of choose how to be an ally. And that was, of course, not a word that was being used in the same way in the early 90s. It's much more in vogue today. But certainly those issues were present for her. Like, how do I work as an activist to kind of help the cause of racial justice as a white person? And that's what eventually led her into death penalty work and in death penalty defense work. And then the kind of arc of her book is that, the arc of her story in the book, she kind of moves from fighting executions as a young lawyer, and many of her peers are burning out. And she says, well, I want to stop the death sentences from ever happening in the first place. So she starts working at the trial stage. So it's like, if the death penalty is this timeline for each case, the execution is the very end. And the very beginning is, the murder is what takes place, but then pretty soon after there's the trial in which a jury decides yes or no to the death penalty. And Dana Lynn becomes this sort of master and sort of generational leader in teaching lawyers, how do you convince jurors to empathize and to see this person, despite their terrible crime, as a human being who, we're not saying let them out of prison tomorrow, we're just saying spare them the death penalty. And that became like her version of activism, and it's endlessly rich and complicated. So I spent several like 8-hour days interviewing her nonstop. I think there was one day where we went for like 10 or 11 hours, and I was exhausted. I was like, can we stop? And she was like, no, we can keep going. Like she was like, I mean, if you want to stop, go. And I was like, oh, I'm really tired. But she's one of those people you meet who just has like unbelievable energy, and it's infectious. So
Yeah, I thought it was interesting about her that she actually comes to the Texas Resource Center because she's working on her doctorate thesis on lynchings. And then she never finishes that.
Right.
Because she
becomes convinced that the death penalty is modern day lynchings, essentially. I spend a lot, I also thought it was great to focus on her because her own research, I actually read her, basically her master's thesis from when she was in her 20s, which is like, really, it's interesting to meet someone, in their 50s and then go back and read something they wrote 30 years earlier and just kind of see that same brain at a different spot in their life, And I now I get why people become biographers. Like that seems like such a rich task. And she basically was like looking at history and then realized, well, history is still playing out. And there's a connection between these lynchings and the modern death penalty. That's a connection that now Brian Stevenson and others are making, but it was not a common comparison to make in the early 90s. And she made it as a 20-something University of Texas student, and then but it led her to basically abandon academia and just dive all the way into being a lawyer. But also, in some ways, her work was less legal. It was less about being a lawyer, and it was mostly about empathy. Like, how do we convince the jury to empathize with this person? And that is not always about making the best argument. It's sometimes about telling the best story. And so she's a really, really good storyteller.
Love that. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to ask one more and then we'll do book signing.
Sure.
Are you working on anything new?
Yeah, so I am currently working on a few stories for the Marshall Project. I'm thinking about which one to mention here. I'm actually working on a podcast about a case in Fort Worth, and one of the lawyers is here. And it is basically a wrongful conviction case that circles around the question of how and why people sometimes falsely confess to crimes that they didn't commit. So that'll be coming out in March or April.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We'd love for you to come and join us on January 11th for a discussion with local chef and cookbook author Scotty Scott. He's going to talk about food entrepreneurship and possibly do a cooking demonstration. And that will be at our Chambly Library. And then we'll have a virtual author visit with Patrick Garandi on January 12th. And he's going to talk, his book is about the healthcare system and fighting the healthcare system to get care for his son. It's really interesting. So you'll find more information about both events on our website. For those of you who are online, if you'd like to purchase the book, you can get copies from the Dock, our local independent bookstore. And Lynn has a slide on the screen for y'all with their contact information. And for those of you who are here today, Maurice is going to do a signing. Just give us a minute to get him set. And then the Dock is actually here if you'd like to purchase copies of the book.